Hello, tea lovers! Welcome to Rebecca's Tea Cozy, where we share our love of tea and other things that are cozy to nourish our bodies and our souls. On today's episode of Let's Talk Tea, we're going to be diving in to how the water temperature impacts the flavor of the tea. If you tuned into the first episode of our series all about tea, the basics, we discussed 3 steps to brewing a perfect cup of tea. Today's episode is going to explore a little bit more in step 3, steeping, and how there are a few tips in the steeping process that you can use to bring out the best flavor in your tea. So today's episode is going to look specifically at water temperature and how that impacts the flavor of your tea. And again, I also invite those of you who are watching to add to our comments any tips that you may have for us, or if you hear an error that I make, or maybe there's something that I need to share a little bit more in depth that I missed, I invite you to add to the comments so that we can learn from each other. Just a reminder that all of our comments here should be helpful and be encouraging and be supportive. And we appreciate you being part of our community that is learning and growing together. Whether you're steeping tea bags or loose leaf teas, the type of tea that you're drinking will determine the temperature of the water that will bring out the best flavor for that type of tea. You see, the tea leaf has polyphenols, otherwise known as antioxidants, which some of you may be familiar with that word, and those protect the plant when it's in its natural state. The type and amount of polyphenols in the tea is partly dependent on its level of oxidation. So black teas are the most oxidized tea. Think brown. If you leave an apple out exposed in the air, it turns brown. That's the same process that the tea is going through. So black teas have been allowed to oxidize. The least oxidized tea are your green teas, hence they're green. The oxidation process has been halted, so the leaves remain green. So the temperature of the water is going to impact the level of polyphenols that are released from the tea leaf. That's one factor, which is the one that we're going to focus on today. So there are some general rules of thumb as to the water temperature that you should use for teas that are more oxidized and teas that are less oxidized. When drinking black teas or more intense teas like darker oolongs, you want to use a higher level of water temperature, a little bit close to the boiling point. So recommended range would be around 195 to 210 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 90 to 98 degrees Celsius. When drinking your less intense teas or less oxidized teas, you want to stay in the range of about 165 to 185 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 74 to 85 degrees Celsius. Those are ballpark ranges that will help you bring out a better flavor within your cup of tea. Now you'll notice there is quite a bit of variance within those temperature ranges. So it is recommended that you look at the packaging that your tea came in to see what was recommended by the company, and they may have the best insight into the specific temperature that will work for that particular tea. I've also included a link to a temperature calculator in the description so that if you're interested in exploring this a little more, you can put the specific type of tea in and it will tell you the temperature that that tea will best be brewed. Now, why is this important? Because polyphenols can tend to have a bitter taste. And so if they're released too quickly or too long, then you're going to taste a bitterness to your tea. And as we said in the first episode, if you were tuned in, that some people don't like the flavor of green teas. And part of it is because they're brewing it similar to as they would a black tea. And so it's too high of a temperature. And it's basically burning the leaves, as we would say, or it's bringing out those tastes of the polyphenols that are making it taste extremely bitter. Whereas if you lower the temperature of water that you're using to steep the green tea, you'll find that it has a much better flavor. So, ready to put this to the test and see exactly how the temperature of the water impacts the flavor of the tea. Just in case you're not convinced yet, we're going to do a little tasting experiment right now. So hang tight, I'll be right back with our setup and the details of the taste test. So we're all set up for our experiment. Let me share a little bit about it with you before we actually begin. So for the purpose of our experiment, I'm going to be using a Sencha green tea from Artful tea. And I'm selecting a green tea because that is one of the teas that typically people don't like the flavor of, and the water temperature is a significant impact on that. So we're going to be using this tea to conduct our taste test today. Now, the other thing about Sencha tea is this is a Japanese green tea. Just a little thought to put out there. I haven't done a lot of exploring on this, but some of the reading that I did showed that Japanese green teas, because of the way that they're processed and heated to stop the oxidation process, that they have a different water temperature than the Chinese green teas do, which uses a different process to halt the oxidation. So just something to put out there for those of you that may be interested in researching that a little bit more. So our tea will be a Sencha green tea today. I've put the same amount of tea in each of the tasting cups that we're using. And this particular tea recommends about a level teaspoon per 6 ounces of water, and to steep it at about 180 degrees. We're going to talk about that in just a second. And to steep 1 to 2 minutes. So for the purposes of our taste test today, we'll steep about 1.5 to 2 minutes, completely equal, so that the only thing that we're going to change today is the temperature of the water. So we have 4 different cups that we're going to be steeping. This cup we're going to steep close to the boiling point. Now, as soon as I pull it off the water is going to drop a couple of degrees, but we'll be close to that point of 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. This cup we're going to steep just a little higher than the recommended temperature, 90 degrees Celsius or 194 degrees Fahrenheit. This cup we're going to steep at 80 degrees Celsius or 176 degrees Fahrenheit. And then this cup we're going to steep at 70 degrees Celsius or about 158 degrees Fahrenheit. A little bit on the lower end of the recommended temperatures for green teas. So this is the cup that is close to the recommended 180 degree temperature. I wanted to keep it very simple, so I just decreased it by 10 degrees Celsius, knowing that we would still wind up with a green tea ballpark temperature. So we're going to grab our water off the stove, which is now boiling, and pour it into our cup. We'll wait for the next temperature reading and then continue to do so until all of our cups of tea have steeped. I'll be right back. So I just pulled the water off the stove and poured the boiling water immediately into this cup, and I'm letting it steep for 2 minutes. In the meantime, I've put my timer in the water to track when we get down to 90 degrees Celsius or 194 degrees Fahrenheit. So once we hit that temperature, we'll be pouring that into our second cup and then continuing to move down the line as our water continues to decrease in temperature. All right, so all of our teas have been steeped at the respective temperatures of the water that we set out. And now it's time to begin the actual taste test. So before we taste the tea, let's just do a little bit of observation. First, it might be a little difficult to tell in the camera, but there is a noticeable difference in the color of the tea that was steeped at the higher temperature compared to the lowest temperature. So it definitely, even though it was steeped for the same amount of time, extracted the tea at a stronger flavor than at the lower temperature. So that's noticeable by the color of the tea. Now there are some green teas as well that when you steep them, they will almost become brown if you steep them at the higher temperature, and the color is even more intense. In this case, even though the tea color is light, there's still a distinct difference in the color of the tea. The other thing that I was observing, and I don't know if there is anything to this, but in the one that was steeped at a higher temperature, the leaves just seemed a lot more open than the lower temperature. And so I don't know scientifically if that's accurate or if it's just my eyes, but wondering if it opened those leaves quickly at the higher temperature and then released flavor into the water, maybe at a little higher rate than what I wanted, versus at the lower temperature, it's going to unfurl those leaves a little more slowly, releasing the flavors a little more slowly. And then with each steeping, it will just continue to gradually release versus being intense. The other thing I was curious is to smell the aroma from the leaves to see if there's a difference in the aroma based on the higher temperature to the lower temperature. So let's try that now. A little trick I learned from somebody was to sniff your elbow to clear out your scents so that you get the restart of the smell. So even in the aromas, I know you can't smell it through the camera, unfortunately, but even in the aromas, there is a difference between the higher temperature and the lower temperature steeping. The higher temperature, you can almost smell the hint of bitterness that's coming through. It's a little stronger and more intense, whereas in the lower temperatures, it's a little more springy and grassy in a good way. Green tea does tend to have a little bit of a grassy flavor, but like a sweet spring rain grass feeling, fresh and clean. And that's a little bit more evident in this cup, especially just a little bit of a sweeter hint to it. So now that we've looked at the color, we've looked at the leaves, and we've smelled the aroma from the cups, let's go ahead and begin the taste. Starting with the tea that was close to the boiling. Definitely a bitter flavor, and that's overtaking my taste buds. It's the bitterness. You can't really taste some of the nuances of the flavor that I would want or expect in my green tea. There's a little bit of an astringency as well towards the tail end of the tasting. It definitely is not that pleasant, fresh taste that I want in a green tea. So the higher temperature, this one is bitter. Let me clear my palate and then we'll taste the next cup. All right, we're ready for cup number 2, which was steeped at 90 degrees Celsius or 194 degrees Fahrenheit. It definitely still is more intense with that bitter flavor. It's not quite as intense as this one. It's a little more bearable. This one was just unpleasant. This one is a little more bearable, but it's not necessarily a pleasant flavor either because there's a lot of bitterness to it. Let's try the next tea and see if it brings out the nuances of the green tea that you would want. So this is the cup that was steeped at 80 degrees Celsius or 176 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the one that we would expect to have the best flavor because it's within that recommended temperature range for green teas. Well, let's find out if it's actually accurate. So the bitterness that was present in these 2 cups is gone. It definitely has more of that fresh, clean, grassy flavor that you would want in your green tea. It's bright, it's smooth, and it has just a hint of sweetness to it, but enough flavor that's coming out that you can tell that you're drinking tea and not water. Definitely the most pleasant out of the three that we've tested so far. Now let's take a sip from our final cup, which was steeped at 70 degrees Celsius or about 158 degrees Fahrenheit, which again is a little bit lower than the standard recommended temperatures for green tea. So this one also doesn't have that bitter flavor to it. It's nice and mellow, it's clean, but it doesn't have as much flavor as this cup does as far as the intensity of the green flavor, and intensity in a good way, not in a bad way with the bitterness. So this tea, it has a good flavor to it, but this one that was steeped at a slightly higher temperature within that green tea range has a little bit more flavor and enjoyment. So, what have we learned as a result of our experiment? Well, one, we've learned that the recommendations that we read about the temperature range to steep green tea in does have merit, because when steeping at that temperature, it does reduce the possibility of the bitterness in the tea, and it brings out the best nuance of flavors in that tea leaf. And if we're going to spend time drinking and enjoying a cup of tea, we want it to taste the best that we possibly can. Now, this doesn't only impact green teas, it's going to impact any tea that you drink. So what happens if you try to steep a black tea at a lower temperature? It's not going to taste burned, it's going to be the opposite. It's not going to have the flavor that you're expecting or that you would desire, because it's not going to extract the flavors out of that tea leaf that will make that tea taste good. It's going to be very weak. Unless you use something called a cold brew process or a longer steeping process, which we may be able to get into in our next episode a little bit, where we're going to really be talking about the time of steeping and how that impacts the flavor. But the temperature is important, being a higher temperature to pull out the flavors of your more intense teas or your more oxidized teas, and a lower temperature for your less oxidized teas or those teas that are less intense. Now, the tea that we haven't talked about yet is an herbal tea. Herbal teas typically don't have that bitterness that will come out, so they are steeped at a boiling temperature for healing purposes or medicinal purposes. Now, there is a little misnomer that when you're drinking an herbal tea that does not come from the tea leaf plant, that it's actually not a tea, it's called a tisane. Just a little distinction if you want to show off your knowledge. So at this point, some of you might be feeling a little intimidated, wondering how you're going to manage water temperature and getting it precisely right for the tea that you're going to be drinking. So let's talk about a few ways that you can get your water within the range that will be best suited to the type of tea that you're drinking without creating a lot of stress or requiring complex equipment. Before we go into that discussion, I'm going to clean up our area a little bit and I'll be right back. Now that we've determined that the temperature of the water does have an impact on the flavor of your tea, let's talk about some ways that you can bring the water to the correct temperature even if you don't have a fancy kettle that gauges the temperature for you, which I don't, so I have to use some of these other methods. One method is to use a cooking thermometer. And although this is precise, I don't know about you, but I don't feel like standing over my pot of water waiting for it to get to the right temperature to then pull it off the heat. So let's talk about a few others that are a little more simple and will allow you flexibility. First, you can observe the water as it's heating and get to know the signs of what the range of temperature is based on the bubbles that are forming. I've posted a link in the description to a video that shows how the water changes with the bubbles based on the temperature and when to pull it off the heat when you've reached the desired temperature for the type of tea that you're drinking. Another method is heating the pot to boiling and then pulling it off the heat and letting it sit for a few minutes. Now, the suggested guideline is that your water will drop about 5 degrees for every 1 minute, which I shared in the first video, and I have tried it in 2 different types of vessels, and it was pretty accurate. Now, this pot, though, would be very different cooling compared to a kettle that had a long, skinny neck and was going to hold the heat a little bit more. So you have to kind of ballpark it based on what you have. But if you pull it off the heat and let it sit for a few minutes, it is going to drop that temperature, so it will at least be a little bit closer in the range for your lighter teas. Another method that I use frequently is, if I don't have the patience to pull it off and wait for it to cool down, is I put a little bit of cool water in the bottom of my cup, and then I pour the boiling water over my tea leaves so that the water will mix and become at about the right temperature for steeping. Another method is to pour the boiling water into your cups or another vessel, and then pour that water into another vessel. So let's say there are 2 of us enjoying a cup of tea. We're going to pour the boiling water into these cups, and then we're going to pour that water into our pot and then allow it to steep. The suggested temperature change is about 10 degrees Celsius for every vessel that you pour it into. So if it starts at 100 degrees, which is boiling, I pour it into these cups, it suggested that it would be 90 degrees Celsius. And then when I pour it into the teapot, it suggested that that would be about 80 degrees Celsius for steeping, which would be around the range that I would be desiring for my green tea. Now, the other benefit of that method is it also warms the cups up that you're going to be drinking, so the tea will stay at a nice temperature for you to be enjoyable as you're sipping with a friend. In the tea calculator link that I put in the description, it not only includes the temperature, as we mentioned earlier, for the type of tea, but it also has a section where you select the method that you're using to heat your water. And one of them is pouring it into other vessels. So it's a great calculator for those of you who want to learn a little bit more about the precision of the water temperature and explore that. I invite you to check it out. Before we end our conversation on water temperature, there is one additional point that I want to bring up. As I was researching what the best temperature would be and heating the water, whether to bring it to boiling or whether to just bring it to the temperature that you need for your tea, there seems to be a lot of controversy, and both sides seem to be claiming that it's based on scientific evidence. So I will leave that to the experts, and I will leave you to select the method that works best for your daily life, which most likely is quite busy. Now that we've had a discussion about water temperature and the impact of flavor on tea, I would love to hear your thoughts. What additional ideas do you have? What have you learned? Or what are some things that maybe you can bring to what I've shared to clarify or deepen our level of knowledge? Again, we invite this time to be a community of learners so that we all are bringing our ideas to share and help each other learn and grow, since we're all passionate about our tea. If you'd like to reach out to me directly, I would love to hear from you at rebecca@rebeccasteacozy.com. It would be great to connect. I look forward to seeing you next week at our standing reservation for Let's Talk Tea right here at Rebecca's Tea Cozy. And until then, be blessed with a cup of tea.